Heroic Failures was a pilot episode based on the book of the same name. This was for Anglia Television, ATV, a company that no longer exists. Their main studios were in Birmingham, where we were recording the show. We actors would act out on film or perform events in front of the studio audience that were either in the book or situations sent in by a member of the public. An example of the show might be one taking a driving test and driving over the neighbour's cat. I don't recall any accidents to animals actually occurring. In fact, I don't remember much about the setup at all, but you get the idea. The studio was fronted by Liza Goddard and Lance Percival, with Nigel Planer in the cast. Each week, Liza and Lance were to interview a surprise guest to recount something they had attempted in their lives that they had failed at heroically. Our first surprise guest for the show, and it turned out our only show, was the writer and comic genius Spike Milligan. As the audience were enjoying our live sketches and film clips, Spike had not shown up ready to do his spot. We carried on, hoping by the time we had finished, Spike would have arrived. Word got through to us that Spike had been driven to Elstree Studios, ATV's southern base, by mistake, and was last seen walking around talking to a Muppet. Spike's PA driver was persuaded to get Spike to Birmingham ASAP. In the meantime, our director got one member of the cast to speak to the audience. I think it was me. Ladies and gentlemen, because of a technical hitch, we've got to do the show all over again. We do apologise, but please could you remember where you laughed the first time round? In my experience, audiences love it when things go wrong, and even more so when they feel part of the show. We wasted time fiddling about for a bit, making it look like we were getting reset to reshoot, giving Spike's driver more time to get to Birmingham from Elstree. We did the show again. The audience loved it just as much the second time around, laughing in all the right places. Spike eventually arrived just in time to do his thing and gave a comic account of that very evening, which was almost an heroic failure for us all. After the show, Spike was introduced to us actors in the green room because we hadn't had time to know each other beforehand. For some reason, Spike stopped behind the chair I was sitting on and placed his hands on my shoulders and began to unconsciously give them a friendly massage. The producer told Spike they'd booked him and his PA rooms in the hotel. I don't think that was the original plan because we should have recorded the show early enough in the day for Spike to return to London. He'd had a long journey. It was quite late, and they thought he wouldn't want to leave until the morning. But Spike being Spike, where the join between life and art becomes blurred at times, he insisted on driving back to London right away. He said, No, you must keep it going, or you'll spoil it. With that, Spike departed with his disgruntled driver in tow. We never went to series, but I was touched by the master in a way. I'll always remember his chummy shoulder massage as he stood behind my chair. My own real-life heroic failure, apart from the humiliating scoreline when we played football for the Everyman Theatre, is as follows. Now, being the kind of actor I am, you might think I was born to play the part of Alfred Doolittle in Shaw's Pygmalion, or as it was in this case, the musical based on the play My Fair Lady. I'm a Cockney. I have a face that is well lived in and a fine baritone voice. The time came, and I auditioned for the part to play Doolittle in My Fair Lady at the Crucible Theatre, Sheffield. I was not their first choice and did not initially get the role. A few weeks had passed when my agent phoned to say that the actor, who had been rehearsing Doolittle for the past few weeks, had to pull out due to ill health, and would I be interested in taking over? I demurred somewhat because I'd only have 9 days rehearsal. I asked for time to consider the offer, but was told they need to know that evening, within the next couple of hours, in fact. I accepted the offer and was being fed the script by fax when a friend of mine arrived because we had arranged to go out for a curry that evening. On looking back, oh, how I wish I'd done just that, but no, I had accepted the job. My chum helped me piece the Doolittle script pages together as we ate our takeaway curry delivered from the local restaurant. The director of the production was very reassuring on the phone and told me, although you have a short rehearsal period, Robert, I have a plan to work you into the show, ready for the opening night. As it turned out later, he had been quite creative with the truth, bred of desperation and wishful thinking. The production demanded a very long and complicated technical rehearsal, which had got underway a few days after my arrival. The revolving stage and other technical things began to go wrong, presenting them with a lot of problems. The main cast were on constant standby to get on the set. I hardly had any opportunity to rehearse with the other principal players. I had to make do with the understudies, or ballet master, and a pianist playing my numbers on an upright piano in an echo chamber of a rehearsal room. Now, near to opening night, we had a full musical call with the orchestra. Now, this was the first time I'd really sung in a proper musical. I'd sung on stage lots of times with a pianist or a band. I'd sung in old-time musical productions, stuff like I Live in Trafalgar Square. I've sung playing the cook in Brecht's Mother Courage and similar productions written by John McGrath and Adrian Mitchell. But this musical malarkey was a whole new ballgame. This was a fully fledged commercial-type musical with proper choreography, song and dance numbers, 3 of which were led by yours truly, playing one of the principal parts. The first night I almost shat myself waiting to go on, knowing I was not ready. I could hear the music, my cue was approaching, and I made my entrance. I was so nervous that I fluffed the first few lines, but somehow got through to the end. I was in front of the beat or behind it on occasion and paraphrased some of the spoken dialogue. Now, many of the cast had worked only in musicals or opera. They did not have the tradition of most actors I've worked with on stage to paraphrase back, help a chap to get back on the script. The other thing was the musical director, conductor, had to work from a strict word cue to bring in the music. But of course, I was a bit of a mess, and the reviews reflected it. Why was Putt the only one who didn't know his lines? Another acknowledged that I'd had a short rehearsal period, but he didn't think I would ever be good enough in the part. Another reviewer, bless her, wrote how well I had done considering the short time I had to rehearse. I slowly began to get on top of the role, but I was rarely on firm ground. The trick I hadn't got was, in a musical, you must first and foremost always listen to the music and concentrate on any dance choreography. It makes sense now, but then I was completely befuddled with nerves and uncertainty. I am what you call a method actor, and the moment I got lost in playing the truth and forgetting the music's technicalities, I was in deep trouble. On one early performance, I forgot the words to one verse completely, and I trial-larded my way through the song, hoping to God, when I danced my way over to the next position on the stage, I'd remember the rest of the number, which thankfully I did. At the curtain call that night, I heard someone boo as I took my bow. I did get there in the end, and some folk who came to see the show, not just family and friends, but fellow musical pros of the cast, said I gave the best Doolittle they had ever seen. It was such a horrendous experience that it has taken me till now to feel I can visit that time once again without breaking into a cold sweat. Sheffield was a baptism of fire. I've worked on musical productions since, not as full scale as the one at the Crucible, but I learnt a lot and know which way round one should approach the part. Firstly, you must listen to the music and then get the dance steps sorted and hope that you give enough credibility to the character. Knowing this now has not inspired me to pursue the genre further. I will have to be offered a stack of dosh to give voice ever again. I got a part as a lorry driver in a lager commercial for an Austrian company. My role in the ad was to drive a 1930s-looking truck to the brewery to pick up a load of lager, but on arrival they wouldn't give it to me, the inference being it was too good to part with. We were filming in Falkenstein, an area that was once the Russian zone of East Germany. This was some time after the wall had come down, and the German people were free to roam wherever they pleased, in their own country. When we actors arrived at the hotel, ready for our evening meal, there was only some bits of buffet food on offer. Well, we became a bit disgruntled. Us film folks love food and drink like anyone else, especially when away from home. It's one of the perks of the job. The hotel manager rustled up a hot meal from the kitchen, which consisted of curled cow tongue and dry bread. These strips of long-dead bovine were so dry and tough, I think the poor beast had been pulling wagons when Trotsky was a boy. Needless to say, not much was eaten, and we retired to our rooms full of buffet nibbles. The filming was an evening shoot, so having time on my hands in the day, I thought I'd take a stroll around downtown Falkenstein. Looking like the foreigner I obviously was, I attracted some interest from the passing locals, who, when I made eye contact with them, looked down quickly to the ground. I thought perhaps, because of all those years of suspicion and repression, that paying too much attention to folk had not been, in past times, advisable, and they found it difficult to break the habit. Or maybe it was just rude to stare in Falkenstein. The main shopping centre consisted of one main street. The area looked as if it had been recently renovated, with a new-looking pavement and some arty stone sculptures dotted about. It was spotlessly clean, but soulless. After a stroll up and down the street a couple of times, I found little to interest me, so I began to wander back the way I'd come. There were very few people about. You could count the perambulating locals in the main street on one hand. On the way out of town, I got this feeling I was being followed. I'd walked 10 minutes or so from the main centre, and I seemed to be the only person about, apart from this one guy walking in the same direction as myself, but keeping a clear and obvious distance behind me. He was about 30 yards back, but near enough for me to see he was probably aged between 40 and 50 years old and wearing a dark raincoat. At one point I glanced around to see the guy was still there, but he had crossed to the other side of the road. I stopped briefly to look at nothing in particular, like I was checking my surroundings, and there he was, walking with his head down and slowing his step enough to keep the same distance between us. I thought I'd been reading too many spy thrillers, and my imagination was getting all a bit too Len Dayton and John le Carré. Passing a small housing complex, I thought the guy might live there and was going home. After a while I looked over my shoulder to find he had disappeared, and so reassured I headed back towards the hotel. Was I being silly, thinking I was being followed? What the hell for? The Cold War was over. Why follow some harmless actor on a sightseeing tour? Of course, he wouldn't actually know I was an actor, but I am certain I looked quite like a harmless tourist. Falkenstein, like much of that part of Germany, had many ruins of grand houses and castles. I had noticed earlier in a wood, not far from the hotel, there was an old ruin which looked like it had remnants of a battlement of a castle or a manor house, and thought I'd investigate. I entered the wood and climbed up the only remaining stairway to the top. There was just enough space to facilitate about 6 people. As I took in the view over the wooded terrain of Falkenstein, I became aware of a presence nearby. There he was, the same bloke, standing about 8 feet away from me, at the other side of the parapet, pretending to take in the view. The guy had surely followed me from the town and up to the ruined battlement. But why? How did he get up there without me noticing him? There was only the one staircase. I never heard the sound of any footfall or rustle of leafy surrounds. And what was his intention? To scare me? Make me nervous? So, feeling a tad anxious, I decided not to get into conversation with the guy, or even make eye contact. I descended the stairs with what I hoped looked like an unconcerned meander and strolled out of the wood. I glanced back a couple of times, but my tail had disappeared, and I returned to the security of my hotel room. Back in my room, my imagination was working overtime. Was the guy a paid an assassin? I only realised I wasn't a hit when he got a proper look at me on the castle wall. Maybe he had an old score to settle with the West, and I was the one who decided that would pay it. If he had gunned me down, stabbed or garroted me up there in the ramparts, I could be rotting away to this day. Maybe he was a redundant ex-member of the KGB keeping his hand in the hope, or just in case the situation in the East reverted back to the old days. Perhaps he thought I was an ex-CIA MI6 agent trying to keep my hand in. I could have said something like, in a bit of German I could muster, by way of explaining my obvious, very foreign presence, something like, Guten Tag, mein Herr, ich bin ein englischer Schauspieler. Good day, sir, I'm an English actor. But no. Even if I had remembered the above, the situation had turned a bit sinister for my liking and was freaking me out. I think I made the right decision. I mean, any innocent remark or action in a strange place as old as ruined castle in a wood could have morphed into an international incident. There might be a hidden stash of arms or bodies in the wood that I was getting too close to. Who knows? All I did know was the guy definitely followed me. But for what reason? Well, I'll never know. Your guess is as good as mine. Working in a TV studio, theatre, or in particular while hanging about on film locations for any length of time, we actors get to know each other quite well. We're fairly thick-skinned, and there's not much time to pussyfoot around worrying too much about others' sensibilities. If one is perhaps working in an office, which I've never done, it's probably best to take your time to feel each other out. It's doubtful in any job apart from acting that you'll be simulating sex any time soon after your colleagues arrived, or having a pretend fight, sometimes in a matter of minutes after just being introduced. I have never been what you might call a hunk, and as far away from the romantic lead as you can get. I've had the odd role where my character has a quick fumble in the dark or back of a car or a dark corner, but the only real bed scene I've been in was really nothing to do with sex. I played the part of a drag car racing driver in a short film. It's about 20 minutes long, for a small independent company. I think it was one of the last short films for the cinema. It was shown as a curtain raiser for Psycho 2 and Ghostbusters. I was on the set, sitting on the bed, waiting for my actress wife to arrive to do the scene. The actress arrived, came over to the bed, and without an excuse or I beg yours, she removed her dressing gown, standing totally in the buff, muff level with my face. The dresser promptly left the room. Well, she wasn't really required. I tried to stay as casual as I could, kind of trying to pretend this happens to me all the time. We got into bed together, and I had to jiggle about a bit with me seemingly tickling her under the bedclothes. I couldn't help but notice that most of the male members of the crew had somehow found a reason to be on the set at that moment. I could not see what my paws were actually doing under the covers, but I tried to keep a gap between the girl's body and my twitching hands. The director called cut. "Robert, you must tickle faster, and you appear to be only pushing the sheets up and down." Okay, we went again. I pressed my hand onto her middle body with a reassuring smile, and action was called. I tickled away at her middle body, trying to avoid any lady bits. My wife wriggled about, giggled and moved her position further up the bed. At that point, one finger found its way into the middle part of her lady's garden. I whispered, "Oh, sorry. It's all right, just carry on." I don't think she meant carry on with my misplaced finger, but carry on tickling, which I did. The director seemed happy with the scene and called cut, and announced, "We're now going to do the shower scene." The dresser came over with our dressing gowns. It was then I realised I had a slight chubby. So I took my robe and waited until I was alone. All settled down, I put on the dressing gown and joined the team in the bathroom. My wife was standing in the shower, fully naked, but thankfully without hubby, who sat chatting, sitting on the toilet closed seat. I don't think I could have coped well if I was in there with her, because she was a very sexy lady. I was in a children's television series called Harry and the Wrinkles. It's about an old people's home for retired criminals. The main cast in the series was Victor Spinetti, Mona Bruce, Elsa Kelly, George Sewell, Tony Palmer, Gareth Hunt, Brian McRoberts, and Trevor Ziggy Byfield, or quite a distinguished cast, I'm sure you'll agree. It was an unusual job because I was kind of job sharing with George Sewell, or Chuck, as he liked to be called. The job sharing came about because Chuck was on tour when they went to second series, and I was brought in to take his place. Now, I wasn't playing George's part, but his safe-blowing chum, with the same proclivity for overdoing the explosives. And when Chuck's theatre tour finished, he returned to take over, and I made my exit. This seemed to work well, because when they cast the next series, I was offered 3 episodes, and George the others. It was very nice of John, our producer, to do this. I was flattered and grateful for his loyalty and, of course, the nice fee. The setup in the series was young Harry's parents were abroad, and he was living at the old folks' home with his aged aunt, who was managing the place. Harry persuaded us old crims to use our skills to help the good who had been unjustly treated by the bad. The series was a 6-week shoot in the surrounding area of Glasgow, giving us plenty of time to morph into the cast-family relationship. I played the character Banger Jones. The name describes exactly my particular expertise. And Banger would always overdo the jelly. The explosion that ensued would blacken the faces and shred the clothes off anyone close by, which, of course, would be most of the elderly gang. Now, it occurs to me as I record this that many of my actor colleagues, some that I've just mentioned, have made their final exit. It's given me a sense of my own mortality, so I'd better get a wiggle on. There is always one rest day for cast and crew on a shoot, and when you are away from home and on location, it can put you in a holiday mood, whether it's the Caribbean or in this case the glorious Scottish Highlands. But one must always remember, primarily you are there to work, and of course whatever you get up to on your time off, the job must be your first and only consideration. Advice I ignored to my cost. On the day off, I hired a car and took a trip through the Loch Lomond countryside. It was a nice day and the views spectacular, which I thought might get better from up on high. Well, I turned into the nearest car park and after a spot of lunch, decided I would climb up the nearby hill for the exercise and a better view. A small tunnel off the road took me under a one-track railway line, leading into a glen and the hillside. I began my ascent. There wasn't anyone else about, which seemed to add to my adventurous spirit. I decided that I would try and climb to the hill top, to the snowy summit that looked like an icing on a Christmas cake. I set forth, turning back joyously to take in the view of the loch and surrounding countryside. After a while of a less energetic climb, although I was quite a way up the hill, the snowy peak didn't seem to be getting that much closer. It was now getting quite dark, and I decided I'd better give up my self-set challenge, reaching the summit, and turn back. As I descended, it began to get very much darker, so I could not see more than a few feet in front of me. Eventually, it became pitch black, and I could not see where I was actually stepping. Now, a townie like me forgets that in the open plains of the countryside, the ubiquitous light emanating from the city structures of buildings and street lamps are not a feature. Going up, of course, I avoided any dips and pitfalls. I never thought about which way I was going on my zigzag ascent. Now I could not see clearly where I was treading. All was dark. The ground being bog-like and squishy underfoot, I slithered forward. Rushing past a small tree branch, I grabbed it. Stopping to get my breath, I tried to work out which way I'd come. Progressing slowly and very gently, I continued, moving crabwise to the left, towards where I thought the tunnel under the rail track was located. The darkness descending all the time, I could only see shadows around me. My foot, then most of my leg, plunged into a soggy hole and I fell, wrenching the back of my shin muscle. I lay there stuck, almost crying with pain. Well, to be honest, I was having a good squeal. I thought, this cannot be the way I'm going to end my days. You do hear of tales of folk perishing on the Highlands, thinking a stroll up Ben Nevis was a good idea. I gently pulled my leg up, leaving my trainer lodged deep in the soggy pit. I lay for a while breathing in the cold night air. Feeling less tearful, I wriggled about on my stomach and reached down deep into the mud and found my trainer. I pulled it up, emptied out the Highland gunk and squelched the trainer back onto my foot. I stood up slowly and thought, if I keep going carefully in a downward direction, I surely must reach the bottom. I decided it might be safer if I kind of stayed closer to the ground, and sometimes I slid myself downwards on my arse. Finally, I reached the bottom, but couldn't locate the tunnel that went under the rail line. I could see a bit better now, because I was near the road. There were some distant lights, and I suppose my eyes were getting used to the dark. I climbed up on the wall overlooking the rail track. I listened. I could not hear any sounds of a locomotive. I felt reassured, because it was only a single-line track, and probably used during the holiday season, or for special occasion. If it was an intercity line, and I got the timing wrong, lurching across with my newly injured leg, it could have done for me. I can see the headlines now. The parts found along the track are that of the cameo actor known as Robert Putt. Well, managing to avoid getting snagged on the remnants of some rusty barbed wire laced along the top of the wall, I slid down and crossed the line as fast as I could. I pulled myself up onto the wall at the other side, and thankfully, with the full length of my hanging body, it was only a hop down onto the road. Limping back to the car, I passed the tunnel, which was just a few feet away from where I had dropped down. I cleaned myself up in the pub lavatory, discarding my soggy socks in the waste bin, and drove back to Glasgow. Safely back in my hotel room, I tried to massage the ache in my lower leg away, but to no avail. I was able to walk, but only with a protective limp. How was I going to explain my injury to our producer-director? Now, the day before, we had been filming in a disused mine that had, coincidentally, a rail line leading to a lift shaft. The location could be thought, with very little imagination, to be slippy underfoot. I phoned our producer John and told him, "Look, I had a slip on that metal line yesterday in the mine. I thought nothing of it at the time, but now my leg is really painful." John arranged for me to visit the doctor, who, after examining me, decided it was only a muscle strain and gave me some painkillers. I thought, great, all was well, I've covered my arse, well, my leg. I got a fair bit of sympathy the next morning on the set, which I accepted with dismissive grace. As I said before, if on location for any length of time, the people you are working with can often morph into a kind of surrogate family. And only really knowing each other on location, well, it's a bit like living in a little village. Rumours and gossip can become the lifeblood of one's leisure time, spreading like a floodplain or eventually trickle down through the ranks. If you know something, tell one person, and I bet it will be common knowledge within the hour. On the other hand, if you actually want folk to know something, well, spread a little rumour of your own. Tell someone, preferably one of the leading company gossips. There is always one guy or girl who fits the role. And watch it travel. That tiny tale you confided to the makeup artist or acting chum can spread like Chinese whispers, and by the time it gets back to you, that little nugget of gossip has grown into a huge story, almost right for the media. Of course, I've never done anything like that. My tales of my life in art would not, by any stretch of the imagination, be of the slightest interest to the media. But if you're famous, practically everything you say or do is. A day or so later, I had a lot of hanging about with Victor Spinetti, who I often shared on location a trailer dressing room with. Bred of pure boredom, mistakenly, I told him, in confidence you understand, how I had actually injured my leg. Vic told the actress Tony, a very close friend of John, our producer, and grasped me up to him. Thankfully, by the time John had been informed of my deception, I passed the baton back to Chuck to take over our joint roles. Some weeks later, I popped into the French pub in Soho for a swift one before getting the tube back home after a casting. And who did I bump into? Our producer, John. "Hello, Bob. Climbed any hillocks lately?"